And instead we've settled on this topic called Talking Back. And the subtitle of that is Speaking Truth to My Dark Thoughts. Speaking truth to my dark thoughts. You know, the mind never stops. Your mind goes 24/7. It is an amazing organ. It's a world of memory. It's a world of creativity. It's a world of talent and hopes and dreams and analysis and observation and invention. But it's also a pothole, a dark corridor of fears, nightmares, disappointments, guilt, threat, vows, and lusts. All of that is happening in the mind, in my mind, and in your mind. And all of us have dark corners in our mind. We have secrets. We have closets where our potential goes to die. We've hit ceilings of our potential because our mind told us you'll never be able to pierce that barrier. We have cul-de-sacs where joy has dried up, where it's been stunted and blunted because our mind has told us you're never going to find it. You're never going to get there. Something's wrong with you. Sometimes we feel like we're a puppy on the end of a leash and somebody's saying, come, 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 and we keep hitting the end of that leash. And we just don't know why we can't attain what we really want. Or like I used to feel when I was taking 8th grade language arts, you know, English and poetry, and I'd be sitting in class looking out at the playground, you know, thinking, when is recess? You know, looking, you know, you want to put your face up against the glass and go, when can I go out there? Our mind is the product, or it's the processor of all of these kinds of things. And the key to breaking out of this dark corridor, or any of these cul-de-sacs that we have in our minds, is the same place where we started. It's the mind itself, because the mind is plastic. Now that's a word that means it's moldable. The neuroplasticity of the brain is legend. It can change. There'll be 3 sessions during this series where Brad Baczynski is going to come and talk with us. And Brad's a counselor, a psychologist, and he goes absolutely nuts talking about what the brain does. And he can show us empirically what the Word of God has shown us spiritually, that when you change your thoughts, it changes. It literally changes the activity of the brain. And Brad basically is going to tell us over and over again that science is catching up to Scripture when it comes to the mind and the brain. So that's the key. It's not some psychological gimmick. It's what the Bible calls a transformed mind. It's a new way of thinking. It's the discipline of thinking truth and detecting lies and telling ourselves the true side of that equation. So let me give you a little strength assessment. How strong is your mind? How strong is your mind? How able is your mind to exercise productive thoughts? Well, at about 2 in the afternoon, mine is 0. Especially if I've had a big lunch, man. I go into that afternoon slump. How nimble is your mind to assemble relevant facts? How strong is your mind to filter out intrusions and stay on point? How strong is your mind to analyze for error, or to plan intentionally, or to respond thoughtfully, to speak encouragingly, or to override fear? And I could add some things that aren't on the list. How strong is your mind to enjoy beauty? To really rest? You know, to put your head on the pillow and really rest. How strong is your mind to create, or to keep hoping, or to remember? Our minds are working all the time, and this is not a matter of our IQ. We all wish we could improve that, but I don't think we can do that. But it's all about how we exercise our mind. So how tough-minded are you to think correctly, wholesomely, clearly, rationally when I mention the last Vikings loss? Can you be rational and wholesome when you are in gridlock and road construction? How whole is your mind when somebody starts talking about gun control or immigration policy or the wrong political party, whichever one that is for you? How tough is your mind as you face the tax season next year? How wholesome is your mind when you see an attractive woman? Or when you watch the latest ATV commercial and see that? Or how wholesome is your mind when you see your neighbor has just bought that GMC pickup with that revolutionary new tailgate and you don't have one? Or when you see a vacation home, or you dream about vacations, or you see your neighbors going on a cruise? What's going on in your mind? How tough-minded are you to think correctly? Well, the point is, everybody has triggers. Everybody has software running all the time. We all have ruts and loops where the mind goes in gear and it grinds and grinds and grinds and grinds. Sometimes it's about a little project we're trying to solve, but other times it's really some dark thoughts about who we are, what people owe us, what was taken from us, or how we're going to get back at them. And that's all due to our personal history, our family background, our wounds, our embarrassments, our vows. I made a vow when I was about 13. I was in a small church in Golden, Colorado, and my voice was changing, but I was singing in our choir of about 12 people and about 3 men. I was one of those men. But my voice was still changing and cracking a little bit, and we were doing a cantata. Anybody know what a cantata is? You're all too young for that. Churches used to do these musicals at Christmas and Easter, and they were big productions. Well, we had 12 people to do this, but they wanted me to sing a solo, and it was like 5-word solo, just on one note. I got up to sing my solo, and I was petrified. And as I sang my solo, my voice cracked. And probably to anybody else, it was no big deal. But to me, I made a vow. Not out loud, and I don't even remember saying it, but I said, I will never sing another solo in my life. And I've kept that vow, and you'll be glad, actually. Yeah, but little things that have happened to us, and it goes in our mind, and we put a little lockbox around that experience. Sometimes it's a recurring kind of thing. It's abuse. It's being demeaned and diminished. It's feeling emasculated as a part of a team, or being shamed and diminished by somebody in authority. And the mind takes note of that, and it locks it in. And every time anything starts to look like that, we get a whiff that's even a faint whiff of something like that, and we have automatic triggers unless we interrupt them. It's the programming of the mind. And by the way, there's my own practiced selfishness. You know, I've lived inside Roger for 70 years. And I'm pretty good at getting what Roger wants. And so my mind works that way too. So here's what the brain software is made up of. I want to just give you 4 things. Number 1, it's reflexes. Those are those automatic flinches and recoils and self-defense mechanisms to avoid or to lie about something or to go limp. These are the automatic responses when your wife says, hey, how about if we go to ballroom dancing? You know, and you flinch. Or if somebody asks you to speak in public, or somebody invites you to a Bible study, we have a reflex. Then there's the flesh. We go down a little bit lower and a little bit deeper, and there's the flesh. That's the part of me that is still the software running from the old life, the old me. It's the uncoached part of my spirit that God is working on And the Bible calls that the flesh. It's my strategies and unexamined goals. And Proverbs calls it foolishness. Then the next layer down is the world, which is the world system. The world is opposite to God because the world is its own God. And we all came out of that world. But the world still draws us. We're going to talk about that a little bit more. And it doesn't recognize God. It is its own God. And then beneath all of this is the tempter, the devil, the enemy of our soul, the accuser, the snake, the serpent, the lion, the deceiver, the liar, the murderer. And he is constantly bedeviling, literally bedeviling our minds to help us think wrongly about the things that are happening to us or about the situation that we're in. So tonight I just want to give you a process. Tonight's introductory, but it's a little bit of a fire hose, and next week will probably be the same thing because there's so much to say about this. But I want to just talk about, I got this idea of talking back from a 4th century monk. We had a good conversation through his book. His name is Evagrius. He lived in southern Turkey, and he wrote a book called Talking Back. But of course, he wrote it in Greek, and that's its translation. But he was talking to other monks who they have their own mind problems, and he was talking about how they combat the thoughts. And here are his 8 thoughts that he said, these are the thoughts we need to talk back to. Gluttony, lust, love of money, sadness, anger, sloth, vanity, and pride. Basically, it's the 7 deadly sins plus 1. We won't be able to cover each one of those individually, but you can see that this issue, since before Jesus' time, but especially in Jesus' time and the apostles and the New Testament, it's been all about the mind. How do we train the mind to become more useful followers of Jesus Christ? So tonight I want to give you a process. It's a bit of a workout for a daily discipline that will need to be exercised over and over and over and over again. This is not a one-time thing. This is not where you come and you have your baptism, you have your time at the altar, and you just get this. This is going to be a regular workout for the brain. And here's the goal. The goal is to talk back to temptation and darkness and doubt and fear and sadness. It's to talk back to the initial impulse and make sure that we're thinking correctly. And here's the best verse that describes that. It's Philippians chapter 4, verse 8. Whatever's true, whatever's honorable, whatever's just, whatever's pure, whatever's lovely, whatever is commendable, if there's any excellence, if there's anything worthy of praise, what's the next word? Think about these things. Now you can come at that verse from 2 directions. One is the things that happen around you. How do you sift through all the sludge of your day? How do you sift through all the difficult relationships or the hard things that have happened to you and try to find something that's commendable or excellent or lovely in that day? There's that whole filter that we can put on the things out there. But there's another way to think about that, and that is to think proactively, and that is, what am I planning to do with my words and actions today? To put this verse into my mind so that I'm being proactive about the things that I plan to do. Well, let me give you a 3-step process, and these are in the best Wes Feltner mode of 3 R's so that you can remember them. And there's 3 R's I want to give you. One is to recognize, the second one is to resist, and the third one is to replace. So let's walk through those and unpack them a little bit. And then we're going to go and we're going to talk around your tables if you're new at Ironworks. I think the most important thing happens around these tables. When somebody says, this is how it works for me, and when you're willing to disclose something about your own life. So let's, first of all, we start out with recognize. We need to recognize the pattern, the sinkhole, as somebody said, as a friend of mine said, the stinking thinking that takes over, the slippery slope, the pull, the rut. You see, nobody causes me to act in a certain way. I cause myself to respond by what I'm thinking. So pay attention to the symptoms. Here's what it says in James chapter 3, verses 14 to 16. But if you have bitter jealousy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast and be false to the truth. This is not the wisdom that comes down from above, but is earthly, unspiritual, demonic. And here's the key verse I want to hone in on. For where jealousy and selfish ambition exist, and those are thought processes, there will be disorder and every vile practice. Now we could do a lot of drilling down on this passage, but basically there's a whole lot of attitudes and thoughts that James is mentioning, and he says, where you have these, what you're going to see, if you would recognize the symptomology, what you're going to find is disorder and every evil practice. Well, what's some of the disorder of having a mind that's revving on wrong thoughts? Well, how about sleeplessness? Sleeplessness in America is not just because we don't have better beds. It's because people's minds, my mind, that 2 o'clock wake up, it's not just to go to the bathroom, it's thinking about stuff. You have those wake-ups in the middle of the night and you can't stop thinking. And most of the time it's not productive. We have all kinds of upset stomach, elevated blood pressure, the fight or flight ways that so many live under, the vigilance elevates the physical symptoms. Another symptom is isolation or worry, or what I would call awfulizing. Another symptom is cynicism, wrong thinking. These kinds of thoughts that James 3 mentions end up in thinking cynically about almost everything. Can't trust anybody, can't go there, can't do this, this will never work out. It's just cynical. There's projection. Wrong thinking leads to projection. You know what projection is? Projection is taking a small image, putting a light behind it and a lens in front of it, and projecting it onto a larger screen. And this is what happens when we have a wound back in our boyhood or earlier in our adulthood, and it really wounded us, and now something comes along that feels a little bit like that, and we project it onto a massive screen and make it a self-fulfilling prophecy. Often we project that on another person, and it's really not their fault. It was somebody else in the rearview mirror. Another sign of disorder is suspicion and conspiracy and paranoia, joylessness and dread, anger, hypersensitivity, bitterness, addiction, escape, excess, and secrets, unforgiveness and malice, covetousness, jealousy, and envy. Now, I'm not trying to blame you tonight. I'm not trying to take you down tonight. I'm just saying, there are a host of these things that can come through my own brain, my own mind, and I need to recognize where they come from. They don't come from the Spirit of God. They come from an independent, uncoached, untaught, sometimes unlistening mind. So I want to see that be changed. And David was a master at recognizing his inner world. I'm just going to read a couple of snippets out of Psalm 69. But it might be worth your devotional time. David says in Psalm 69, "Save me, O God, for the waters have come up to my neck. I sink in deep mire where there is no foothold. I've come into deep waters, and the flood sweeps over me. I'm weary with my crying out. My throat is parched. My eyes grow dim with waiting for God. More in number than the hairs of my head are those who hate me without cause." So here's David. He's writing a psalm, and he's really going off the rails. He says, I'm up to my neck in trouble. I'm in the deep mire. He exaggerates the number of his enemies. He blames himself But the beauty of what he does is he recognizes it. And by the end of the psalm, he comes back and remembers God's loving kindness. He remembers he's not alone. He brings his mind back to the rock that will stabilize him and give him hope. So maybe tonight is all about the fact of just, as you go from here, recognize when your mind is dragging you somewhere and it's habitual. This is the loop I keep seeing all the time. This is the way I feel in this situation. Whether it's my appetite being sparked, or it's passivity or depression or defeat or destructive habits, whatever that is, this is what my mind, I want to recognize the pattern. And then that brings us to the next key thing, which is to resist this. You can recognize what's happening and you can cut the puppet strings that cause you to think that way. And it goes right back to the root, which is the mind. You can resist and you can find new strength. Here's what it says in James 1, verse 13. Let no one say when he is tempted, I am being tempted by God, for God cannot be tempted with evil, and he himself tempts no one. Each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desire, and then desire, when it is conceived, gives birth to sin, and sin, when it's fully grown, brings forth death. Again, there's a lot in this passage, but the whole point is there's a progression, that there's a conception and a birth, and then there's a death. And the whole implication is you can resist at the beginning of this. If you recognize that you're being lured and enticed toward sin, which is basically death in doses, then the Scripture says we can interrupt this. We can resist it. We can come against it. And it's, usually when we think about, when it says about desire, we usually think about this as lust or passion or appetite or indulgence. But I want to encourage you to recognize something else in our thinking. Sometimes this desire is not an outward appetite, it's a desire to stay safe or to not look foolish or to maintain my veneer of competency or to hide from intimacy or to minimize the trauma of my childhood or to wall myself off from deeper disappointment, to self-limit so I don't get disappointed. You see, these are desires too, and we need to recognize them. I was just talking to a friend of mine this week. He has taken a, what can we call it? Well, he's separated from his wife. He's gone off to live in a little cabin for a couple of weeks to find himself. And actually, he's doing this in a proactive way, unless he does something even worse. But he's saying, I never had the courage in 30 years of marriage to raise some very important issues with my wife. And now they're 30 years into this, and now he's just absolutely emotionally exhausted and doesn't know what to do. And I'm praying for him. We're working through this and all that. We're going to give him some help and all that. But here's my point. His desire for safety was so much more powerful than a healthy thinking that, hey, I need to address this and put this on the table. So those kinds of desires are strong too. And the Scripture says we can resist those and ask God, in this case, what do I need to do? What's the wise thing to do here? In 1 John chapter 2, I won't be able to cover all these verses, but I want to just give you a taste. Because here's what it says in 1 John chapter 2, verses 15 and 16. Do not love the world. That's a resistant phrase, isn't it? Do not love the world or the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the desires of the flesh and the desires of the eyes and the pride of life is not from the Father, but is from the world. And the world is passing away, along with its desires, but whoever does the will of God abides forever. I just happened to catch an hour and a half or so the other night of the new Ken Burns film on country music. And I'm not really a country music, well, I kind of like some of the country music. Some of it's so stupid, it's funny, and then once in a while they'll sing a song that just grabs your heart. But what they show in this is the biographies of all these country artists. And the tragedy, the addiction, the craven desire for fame, and the ruined lives that are left in their train. And it's all about the desire. And it's like, I want to be famous. I want my song to be famous. I want to sell 1 million records. And then they sell them, and now they're afraid they're going to fall off their perch, and so they've got to be up and high and better than last year, and you're only as good as your last album, and it wrecks them. So this is a warning to all of us, that the world system is what I can see, what I can get. It's the cravings of the first Twinkie that comes along for my hunger, instead of a desire for those things that last. And so we need to resist the world, the self-gratification, what the eye sees and pursues, the tangible, sexy, luxurious life that seems to promise everything that we want. And we need to resist pride, which is, I want to do it my way, and independence. Well, I'm not going to even go these other verses, but they're very important. Well, the one I want to just point out is 2 Corinthians 10, verses 4 and 5, that says we need to take every thought captive. We need to take every thought captive, and that's just not an apologetic or theological treatise there. That's talking about the mind. So you got the 2 R's. We need to recognize habits of my mind. So start doing that even right now. If you zoned out, zone back in. I know after 20 minutes, most of our minds are somewhere else. We need to recognize patterns of my mind. Recognize it this morning at 3 a.m. What am I worrying about and why? How do I get out of this loop? How do I change my thought about that person? What can I do to enter more lovingly and joyfully into my marriage? What is it that stops me from doing the things that I know, not only Scripture, but my own heart tells me would be so much more productive? Well, don't get lost in the weeds of self-accusation and shame. Ask yourself the question, what am I thinking? How do I talk back to these things to recognize them, resist them, and here's the third one, replace them. This is the most powerful one. And I just want to point out one verse. It's in Ephesians chapter 4, a couple of verses, one text. Ephesians chapter 4, this is the PhD version of how we become new people on a practical basis. God never just says no. He never just says, stop thinking about red monkeys. Stop it. Stop thinking about red monkeys. What are you thinking about? Stop thinking about that lustful pursuit. Stop thinking about that appetite. He never just says stop. He does say stop, but he says replace. And anybody who's ever tried a diet knows that you can't just stop eating. You have to replace it with some activity, some exercise. You have to ask yourself, where do I want to go? What's my goal? Well, anyway, here are the verses in Ephesians chapter 4, verse 17. It says, now I say this and testify to the Lord that you must no longer walk as the Gentiles do in the futility of their minds. They are darkened in their understanding, alienated from the life of God because of the ignorance that is in them due to the hardness of heart. They become callous and given themselves up to sensuality, greedy to practice every kind of impurity, but that is not the way you learned Christ. assuming that you've heard about him and were taught in him as the truth is in Jesus, to put off, here's the exchange, here's the replacement, to put off your old self, which belongs to your former manner of life, and is corrupt through deceitful desires, and to be renewed in the spirit of your minds, and to put on the new self created after the likeness of God in true righteousness and holiness. Man, this is the secret. This is the key. To put something off, but to replace it with something new. We put off the old and we put on the new. And this is repetitive. This needs to become a habit. It's not a one time at the altar kind of thing. It's a repetition of replacing that old, wrong, hurtful, deceitful thinking with thinking that is healthy. We go back to Philippians chapter 4, verse 8. Whatever's true, whatever's honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is commendable, if there's any excellence, if there's anything worthy of praise, think about these things. I'd like you to memorize that verse. There's a lot of repetition, so just memorize the eight key qualities there. You can do that. And this will be a workout every single day, but here's some examples of replacement in the following verses. It says, therefore, having put away falsehood, let each of you speak the truth with his neighbor, for we're members of one another. So it's exchanging truth for falsehood. He says, be angry, but don't sin. It's changing the way I exercise anger. We're going to talk about that next week. And doing it without sin. He says, let the thief no longer steal, but let him work with his own hands so he has something to give. It replaces negative activity with positive activity. And he says, don't let corrupt talk come out of your mouth, but only such as fit for building others up. It's a replacement. You take off the old, you put on the new, and that's the magic of a renewed mind. So we're going to be walking through some really important topics and learning how you can talk back. Don't just accept what your mind is telling you. Don't just float along on the old software. Start to recognize where it's taking you. Ask God to resist it with His Word and His truth and replace it with something new. And this will be a workout for all of us. We all have stinking thinking. We all end up in places where we didn't think we would ever be. Sometimes we feel like, here I am back in the same cul-de-sac. How do I get out of this? Why am I always like this? Well, again, not to shame anyone, but to say it starts in the mind. And the mind can be renewed. So I have some questions for you, and I'm going to turn you loose to each other. And the one who starts the discussion is the person with the biggest feet. That's how you qualify. But just ask the questions and make sure everybody has an opportunity, if they want to share. Don't dominate. And we're going to just dive right into the deep end here and ask you a question. We don't want to take you any place you don't want to go, but we hope that there's a safety factor here that will develop that says, I'm willing to share a little bit more about myself than I would up in the Commons on a Sunday morning. So share around your tables for the next 25 minutes or so.